South African Police Service is celebrating its annual National Police Day today. The management in the police will be paying homage to the police officials that died in the line of duty. This has been a major conversation in provinces such as KwaZulu-Natal following reports of police officials that have died in the line of duty. These deaths also prompted the Minister of Police, Senzo Mchunu, to call for a new rule that would ensure safety of all police officials when they are responding to the call of duty. But how does one view the state of the South African Police Service, as well as, how does one view the state of the South African Police Service? To unpack this, we are now joined by Dr. Guy Lamb, who's a crime expert from the Stellenbosch University. Dr. Lamb, a very good morning to you. Thank you so much for making time for us. I want to phrase the question in a sense of, so as the country celebrates or marks National Police Day, what should be the key focus as we look at SAPS and its current form as it is today?
Well, I mean, the key focus really is about trying to bring down violent crime rates. South Africa, as we all know, is a particularly violent country. If we look at the international data we have on homicide or murder, South Africa is in the top 5. Most recent data shows it's probably number 2 in terms of countries that report homicide or murder data. Obviously, that's not all countries. There are countries in a state of war. Many countries don't report this kind of data, but as an indication, South Africa has very high levels of violence, and of course, the police are at the front line of that. So their job is really to try and arrest perpetrators and offenders, and ultimately ensure that those who commit crime do go to court and try and do a job that ensures that they get a conviction. So the police's job is particularly dangerous. It's more dangerous than in most other countries. And as a result, we do see men and women in blue dying at the hands of criminals. Obviously, this is a cause for concern. But I think the kind of priority going forward certainly is how can the police bring about reductions in violent crime? Because we've had increases in violent crime over the past 10 years. It's certainly stabilized, but it's stabilized at very high levels.
Yeah, someone would ask, is violent crime, the nature of that violent crime, really the purview of SAPS to almost try and mitigate that particular violent crime, because SAPS would come after the crime has been committed?
It's yes and no. I mean, there's certain things we know, especially when it comes to interpersonal crime, a person perpetrating crime against another person. Often that has to do with arguments, disagreements, interpersonal conflict, consumption of alcohol, or robberies. But we know in South Africa, the leading weapon that's used in the perpetration of crime is firearms. So there are things the police can do around firearms, such as firearms operations, in terms of enforcing the firearms control legislation, to ensuring that criminals don't get access to firearms or those who have violent tendencies. But I think a need and a challenge for the police going forward is, how do we find a way for the police to work better with other government departments to address that? So, for example, in South Africa, we have something called the Integrated Crime and Violence Prevention Strategy, but it hasn't been implemented properly. And what that does is to connect the police more effectively to other government departments, such as social development, such as home affairs, such as treasury, in ways and means to address the drivers of crime, to make the police's job easier. But absolutely, there's many things the police can't do about violent crime, but there are things they can do to bring it down.
Yeah. On the proliferation of firearms, there was the proposed Firearms Control Amendment Bill, and one of the key aspects around that, which the minister at the time also faced a lot of pushback, was to restrict the firearm ownership and also the definition around what self-defense is, and could self-defense really be used to get a firearm. We know what the pushback around that was. But was that a step in the right direction, or did the ministry and cabinet at the time miss the mark?
I don't think they necessarily missed the mark. I think that the point here is, a key problem in the access to firearms is that criminals are accessing firearms from multiple ways. So they're getting it from stealing it from police who are killed, stealing it from police station armories, SAP 13 stores. We've had criminals stealing it from private security companies and personnel. But we see every year, anywhere between about 8,000 and 12,000 firearms are lost or stolen by private firearm owners. And the police looked at this data that they had, and it showed that many of those who had their firearms stolen from them or lost them were individuals who had acquired licenses for self-defense. So they saw this as a key risk category and a way to try and reduce the number of firearms that got lost or stolen. So they adopted this particular strategy. Of course, it has, flown in the face of many concerns within the sort of gun community. And so the kind of idea is, how do you try and prevent this diversion from happening? So the approach is to try and focus on that particular aspect. And of course, it's led to a lot of opposition. So we haven't moved anywhere for years. So I think it is a need to relook at it, but we really do need to look at civilian firearm license owners. We need to look at what are the problems that are leading to loss and theft and try and find ways to address that.
Yeah. Then there's also the issue around the capacity of SAPS. And I guess like the SANDF and the story that we've been covering over the weekend about the impact that the budget cuts have had on the ability of SANDF to be well-resourced is a conversation that we can have about SAPS itself, and also taking into consideration how long it even took SAPS to get to a point where it is able to appoint new recruits for the South African Police Service. But then there's the question about the capacity that the private sector has and the resources that the private sector has, that in sometimes they're even more capacitated than what SAPS is currently capacitated.
Well, it's yes and no to a degree. So if we kind of just your comment about the SANDF, I mean, certainly their budget has been declining. They haven't been prioritized. In the case of SAPS, there have been budget cuts, but they haven't been as targeted and affected as most other government departments. The state has continued to prioritize spending on police. I think a key problem within SAPS has been the detective service, which SAPS itself, the management, has identified. So we have 27% shortage in terms of filled positions. Of course, that varies across provinces. It's the most acute in the Western Cape, where it's about 35% under capacity in terms of detectives. And they're pretty key when it comes to for the police challenging, targeting, trying to reduce crime. And part of the problem here on the private sector is the private sector tends to attract many of the detectives out of government, out of the SAPS, into the private security sector. But in terms of, the private security sector has a lot more personnel than the police, for example, but these aren't necessarily sort of people with specialized training. It's predominantly kind of like visible type private security policing in terms of guarding, in terms of access control. But of course, the private sector does have money and resources, and it does have IT and other kinds of expertise that the police can draw on. So there was a conversation last year, I presume it'll be continuing this year, about the Minister of Police looking to work more closely with the private sector. And I think it's drawing in the expertise around how do you have more modern approaches to crime combating, how do you incorporate technology the private sector has access to kind of deal with the crime problem.
Yeah, and let's speak about the political head of SAPS. What's your view on Senzo Mchunu as the Minister of Police, perhaps in comparison to his predecessor?
I mean, they have very different styles. I think what Minister Mchunu has done is really kind of stabilized. He's an important aspect about him is he does tend to listen, he consults. We've seen, reached out to various political players. We've seen this agreements that have been signed, for example, on the Western Cape, and it's going to happen in other provinces as well, about agreements between national and provincial and city level, so you can pool resources, have more coordinated policing. I think that's a really positive development around that. And I think it's also been around trying to not radically change things. It's about trying to keep continuity in the police, but provide more support to political leadership to work together. And so he's really been about building consensus. Of course, we haven't seen any dramatic changes in the policing strategy, but certainly it's brought stability.
Do you think, as the political head, the way Operation Valumkoti has progressed and what has happened and what has developed, that it may just dent that the image of goodwill that the minister currently has?
I mean, it may, but it's one of many aspects of policing has to deal with. And of course, that particular operation had kind of very devastating consequences. And I think what's going to happen now is a sort of reflection on what sort of approaches were adopted and what were the consequences of that. But the challenge we do have at the moment is, we are sort of from a country point of view quite xenophobic towards, undocumented migrants within this country. And the kind of response, once the state kind of takes a hint from that and, kind of pursues quite aggressive responses to undocumented migrants within South Africa. And in this kind of case, it became quite extreme and we saw consequences, quite devastating consequences as a result of that.
Yeah, thank you so much for your time. Dr. Guy Lam, he is a crime expert from the Stellenbosch University.